First, I want to thank you very much for the kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to be part of this. And I want to thank Pierre-Antoine especially for his kind support when it came to the production of this video and the organization of this event. There are a number of reasons why the depiction of suffering can support humanitarian intention and action. The three most obvious and referred to arguments are: first, information. Depiction makes human suffering visible to a wider audience. Second, empathy. The representation of human suffering can generate individual and collective empathy for the victims. And third, commemoration. The representation of suffering can commemorate the victims and their pain. While these three arguments are applicable to many contexts, they can and should be challenged. In questioning this approach, one claim that has often been brought up by culture pessimists is that an increase in images displaying violence can lead to a numbing response in the viewer. The result, rather than empathy, is something closer to indifference, and indifference rarely supports humanitarian interest. While this type of psychological argument is mainly used within the context of mass media, today I will be discussing an alternative field in which it is also relevant, that of aesthetics. The traditional discipline of aesthetics, I will argue, renders the question of depicted suffering in a very particular way. I will attempt to demonstrate this by showing examples from modern art, as well as employing a brief examination of 18th century aesthetics. I will then analyze the critique of such an aesthetic approach to suffering in order to locate the problem within the recent discussions, commonly referred to as identity politics. So let me start with a short anecdote. In summer 2014, I was invited to a preview of an art exhibition at the Kunstmuseum Basel. As part of a group of researchers, I attended a private tour of the solo show by American artist Charles Ray, who acted as our guide together with the art historian Michael Fried from Johns Hopkins University. On the tour, we came across his work Sleeping Woman from 2012. It's a life-size sculpture made out of cut steel. In describing the work, the artist explained us with great enthusiasm that he by chance came across a black woman sleeping on a public bench in Los Angeles and was motivated to photograph her. Ray would often comment on the sculpture in interviews in much the same way. For instance, in the New Yorker in 2015, he stated, quote, "Her sleep was geological. She slept like a mountain sleeps, unwakeable, with cars and trucks going by. When I got home 45 minutes later, I looked at the pictures and realized I didn't have enough. So I walked back and took some more. She hadn't moved. I think she's an incredibly beautiful woman." End quote. This work, which depicts a homeless black American woman sleeping on a public bench in LA, caused immediate discomfort in our group of scholars. It felt as if something political was inserted into the work of art as a result of his description, even though it was intended to be viewed and understood as something purely aesthetic. What is further striking is that Ray's approach is not a strictly formalistic one, but rather it involves the subject matter in a crucial way. Ray is not blind to the subject matter of the work. Rather, is the subject matter crucial for his aesthetic judgment? In this concept of aesthetic judgment, the unwakeable sleeping woman on a public bench serves as a model for the viewer's absorption, by which he forgets about all economic and social conditions which shape the depicted figure and therefore his work in an essential way. It is this aesthetic mode, a particular way of perceiving an object, that questions the alliance of art and humanitarianism. Let me show you another example to clarify what I mean by aesthetic mode. The Galleria Civica d'Arte in Torino holds a sculpture entitled La Schiava from 1877. It's made by the Italian sculptor Giacomo Ginotti. The life-size work in marble depicts a naked woman whose right ankle and wrists are tied up with chains. She wears a headscarf which, together with her upper armband, was likely intended to accentuate her exotic origin. Her wrists hide her pubic area and she tries to cover her naked breasts with her arms. Let's have a quick look how contemporaries in Europe interpreted this piece of art in the 19th century. The authors and publishers Clovis Lamarre and Amédée Roux write in their publication for the 1878 World's Fair in Paris, quote, Nous n'avons pas sous les yeux un marbre insensible, mais de la chair vivante, dont tous les muscles semblent frémir à l'unisson. Jamais statuaire n'a plus parfaitement assoupli une matière rebelle, et cette œuvre bien conçue et bien exécutée. End quote. In this benevolent description, the aesthetic mode comes into play again. The double meaning of the term rebellious material places the callous marble of the sculpture in a direct relationship with the depicted subject, the living flesh and the trembling muscles of the slave. Here too, the authors are not blind to the political implications bound up with the iconography of the work. Yet they look at it from an exclusively aesthetic perspective. The two examples discussed so far illustrate how suffering is used as a subject matter for aesthetic practice. Thus, they demonstrate that the aesthetic mode is at risk, consciously or unconsciously, to look at the suffering from a very distant viewpoint, with less interest in the value of human life and its condition than in its beauty. As such, the aforementioned three arguments, which use information, empathy, and commemoration as a justification for display of violence, are barely applicable in the service of aesthetic mode. There is first no information about the identity of nor the reason for the suffering person. Second, instead of empathy, the viewer is encouraged to feel aesthetically pleased. And third, due to the lack of identification and empathy, commemoration is simply not possible. The question that I want to pursue is, what is it about the aesthetic mode that strips bare the suffering subject from its humanitarian significance? My suggestion is that a historical concept of the aesthetic is responsible, namely the concept of the so-called disinterestedness of the aesthetic experience. Disinterestedness has a history that can be traced back to British aesthetics, very defined in the writings of Shaftesbury and Burke, and from there it enters into German philosophy, most famously in Immanuel Kant's work. I will focus on the Kantian conception of disinterestedness, which he develops in his critique of judgment, in order to establish how suffering is related to aesthetic experience. The title of the paragraph already formulates the basic argument. The liking that determines a judgment of taste is devoid of all interest. So interest is here defined in the same paragraph as, quote, the liking we connect with the presentation of an object's existence, end quote. Interest is therefore related to the existence of an object. This existence of the object is important because only its existence can affect the subject, as Kant says in the following paragraph. Quote, now that a judgment by which I declare an object to be agreeable expresses an interest in that object is already obvious from the fact that, by means of sensation, the judgment arouses a desire for objects of that kind, so that the liking presupposes something other than my mere judgment about the object. It presupposes that I have referred the existence of the object to my state insofar as that state is affected by such an object." End quote. Interest thus refers to an object whose existence produces a sensual effect on the body, something Kant refers to later as pathological. Having coffee or a hot shower, for instance, is something agreeable, as it is based on sensual bodily experience. As such, it comes with interest, and is therefore not to be confused with aesthetic pleasure, according to Kant. It's important to highlight that interest and its pathology are systematically excluded from the aesthetic judgment. Another quote: "Taste is the ability to judge an object or a way of presenting it by means of a liking or disliking, devoid of all interest." End quote. So unlike sensory judgment, aesthetic experience is free of any need for its object. Herein lies one origin of aesthetic autonomy. Aesthetic judgment is not only resistant to any concept or objective rule, so we can never argue on beauty, but also excludes the sensual effects, which cause the sensory judgment. This autonomous position of the aesthetic experience then leads to the well-known formula of the free play, in German das freie Spiel, between imagination and reason, in which, according to Kant, these cognitive capacities and finally the idea of freedom is affirmed. In regard to the problem of an aesthetic of suffering, I'd like to have a closer look at the role of suffering in Kant's aesthetic theory. We have so far seen that he clearly distinguishes between the disinterested aesthetic judgment and the interested sensory judgment. Kant makes clear that both can appear in different ways. The aesthetic can come to play first as positive, as a liking of an object, or second as negative, as a disliking of an object. Sensory judgment can also appear in two different ways. Namely, first as positive, as agreeable, and second, negative, as pain. So now it's needless to say that pain in Kant's aesthetic is completely hostile to aesthetic experience, because the experience of bodily pain can only come with the interest of overcoming that very same pain. Or in other words, I cannot enjoy my pain aesthetically because I want it to stop. This is no longer the case if the pain is not mine. The pain of another can become the object of aesthetic pleasure, and as I have shown, it can be looked at with disinterestedness. Interestingly, Kant's distinction between the suffering experience and the aesthetic experience returns within a currently popular challenge of aesthetic autonomy, namely the arguments of identity politics. Let me quickly explain with one last example. The painting Open Casket from 2016 by the US artist Dana Schutz triggered a critique of aesthetics. The painting depicts the body of Emmett Till, a black American boy brutally murdered in 1955. The boy was a victim of a racist act of violence, and the painting refers to the iconic photograph of the boy's body, disfigured by violence. While being exhibited in the Whitney Museum of American Art in 2017, activists and writers recognized an illegitimate aesthetic appropriation of experienced suffering that is shared by a particular group, namely Black Americans. They argued that the painting uses black pain as raw material and that black suffering has transmuted into profit and fun. If I understand their arguments correctly, they don't want to ban the subject matter of suffering generally from aesthetic practice. They rather demand that the aesthetic processing of certain subject matters be reserved exclusively for the concerned group. Following this argument, A reasonable aesthetic of the suffering would consist in the division of society into distinct communities with certain authorities on certain subjects, while traditional aesthetics left no space for particular interests connected to social reality and aimed for a pureness and autonomy of the arts. Identity politics is entirely focused on reality and the related identities. So, what conclusion can we take here? We can consider these discussed positions as two extremes which open a space for critical navigation when trying to achieve humanitarian goals through art. It is a navigation between, on the one hand, making use of aesthetic autonomy, where everybody has access to any topic, no matter how delicate it is. On the other hand, the aesthetic processing of such topics has to respect the particular concerns by certain groups who are involved with the topic in a more intimate way. Under the banner of artistic freedom and artistic autonomy, the field of aesthetic has been able to ignore some moral standards that have become relatively normal in our world. The current social climate calls for more sensitivity when it comes to particular topics. I think if we truly believe in the capacity of art to achieve humanitarian goals, why not accept that there are a number of blind spots to it and work towards overcoming them? I leave it there and thank you very much for your attention.